It's cold up here, colder than it is in Seattle. But I'm glad to be here. It's part of a book tour that I'm doing. And this book took me almost 15 years to write. And I feel it's a very important book because I think the story of the Black Panther Party needs to be told. There have been other books that have been written, but I think my book is a little different in that I try to add a little more context to why the Black Panther Party came about. And in this book, I spend a lot of time in the first couple of chapters talking about my family history, talking about my ancestors, my slave ancestors, and the journey of my ancestors on both sides of my family out of slavery, and all the trials and tribulations that they had to go through, which really led to the formation of the Black Panther Party. I left Chicago. Let me see. My father was an artist. He graduated from Chicago Art Institute. My mother was a classical pianist. And when my father was 18 years old, he went to, he was drafted into the Army and was sent to boot camp. And from boot camp, he was sent down to Mississippi. On the train to Mississippi, along with his fellow officers, they closed all the windows and they painted the M on his helmet and on the helmets of all the black soldiers because they didn't want to know where they were going. They thought they were going to Mississippi or Michigan or Minnesota, and lo and behold, they were going down to Mississippi. And Mississippi in the 1940s was not a hospitable place for black people, particularly if you had a uniform on. If you were a black man with a uniform on in Mississippi, anywhere in the South, that was very provocative, and anything could happen to you, and anything did happen to any black soldier who was by himself with the uniform on. So my generation is a generation that grew up on what is called the oral tradition. Probably some of you young people don't know what the oral tradition was. I see some Native people here. He probably understands what the oral tradition was. But the oral tradition was something that was very valuable and very important to all cultures, because the oral tradition was the way that we prepared the young people to take the place of the elders and move forward with the concepts of what the community and what the family wanted to achieve. And I just remember being immersed in this oral tradition with my grandparents and my parents and my aunts and uncles and my great-great-grandmother. They were always telling us. They were always telling us about history, for one. I lived in the house with my great-great-grandmother at one point. She was born in 1867, and I listened to her stories about her mother, who was a slave, and I listened to the stories of my grandparents, and my parents, and the struggles that they had dealing with racism, and the struggles they had dealing with oppression. But also there were a lot of good stories as well, stories of achievement and stories of success. And within this oral tradition, there was a value system that was always taught to us too. First of all, the elders. The elders was something that was the most revered and most respected element in our communities. And my generation was a generation that was raised to learn to respect the elders. And if you were walking down the street and you saw Mrs. Smith walking down the street, you would always stop and say, "Hello, Mrs. Smith, how are you doing?" Or, "Can I carry your groceries for you?" or whatever. And so this was a very important part of the oral tradition. There was a very important part of passing down the values that we had as a community and as a people. So also part of this oral tradition was that the young people were also the most cherished element in the community. And so everybody in the community played a role in raising the children. You know, there were a lot of single mothers back in that time period when I was growing up, but those single mothers had a lot of support. They had a lot of support from the neighbors. They had support from the aunts and the uncles, you know, from the community. Everybody participated in making sure that those kids were taken care of. And there was always father figures. Even the father may not have been there, but there was an uncle who oftentimes would step up and replace the father that was missing. So this was our community, and this was the community of a lot of other ethnic communities as well. This is how we held things together, and this is how we gave a sense of purpose to young people. There was also something that was going on when I was growing up, and that was the civil rights movement. And my generation was a generation that had an opportunity to watch the civil rights movement unfold. You know, we only had like 4 or 5 TV channels at that time, and the TV channels they all went off at midnight, and there was very seldom when we would have an opportunity to see a black person on TV. But we knew when the news came on that there was going to be some news about what was going on in the South. So all of us young people and the parents, we would all gather around the TV and we would watch the civil rights movement unfold. We watched Martin Luther King leading his demonstrators and leading his followers into battle as they demanded equal justice and demanded an end to segregation. You know, we watched the news when the church in Birmingham, Alabama was blown up and the 4 little black girls were killed. We watched the news when the 3 civil rights leaders were murdered. And so, you know, as a young person, you know, as a black child or a person of color, and even young white people at that time, you know, watching these things really began to affect us and really began to instill something into our minds. You know, there was also the political assassinations that also took place in the 60s. You know, my generation was a generation that watched 4 to 5 political assassinations take place. You know, the first one, and one of the very serious ones, was the murder of John F. Kennedy, the first Irish-American president elected to office. And this was the first time that we had a president in office who really was supportive of the civil rights movement and was supportive of what black leaders were demanding and asking for. And so, you know, we felt finally we had someone in the White House that's going to listen to us. Now, before that, you know, when Jim Crow started in the 1880s and they began lynching black people, you know, there was at least all the way up until 1950s, black people were lynched, and it was not illegal. It was not a crime to lynch black people. And we're talking about thousands of black people that were lynched from the 1880s on forward. Every president that came into office, black leaders would go and other leaders would go and say, would you outlaw the death penalty? And not one single president, from Woodrow Wilson on to Theodore Roosevelt, would make lynching illegal. It wasn't until 1950 when Harry Truman became president that finally lynching was outlawed. And that's almost 70 years of this thing going on where people of color, black people in particular, were being lynched, and nothing was ever done about it. So it was great to see John F. Kennedy come into the presidency and really finally work towards what black people were asking for. But early on in his presidency, about a year and a half into his presidency, he was assassinated in Houston, Texas, right before our very eyes. And we watched this on TV over and over. We watched Lee Harvey Oswald, and we watched the bullet hit the president. We watched him slump over and the blood splatter. We saw Lee Harvey Oswald getting killed. Um, and you know, it was traumatic for us as young people to be watching this. We didn't realize it at the time, but it was a very traumatic incident. And for the elders, it was very painful for them to see this, to see this president murdered the way that he was. But the assassinations didn't stop there. In 1964, Medgar Evers, who was one of the staunch leaders of the civil rights movement, was assassinated in Mississippi. And Medgar Evers was a powerful civil rights leader. He was right up there with Martin Luther King. But the difference between him and Martin Luther King was Medgar Evers believed in self-defense. And he had weapons in his home, but he believed in defending himself. And maybe that's one of the reasons why he was targeted and murdered. But in 1964, he was murdered. A year later, Malcolm X, one of the most fiery, one of the most powerful black leaders that Black America had ever seen, was also assassinated. And now when Malcolm X was assassinated, that really kind of set the fire that really began to lead to the development of the Black Panther Party, because you know, Malcolm X had traveled to the Arab world. He began to change his views. He began to look at things at a more international level. He began to look at the whole movement and the whole struggle on a much broader level. And that's one of the reasons why he broke away from the Nation of Islam and began to form his own organization. Unfortunately, he was assassinated before he had an opportunity to get that organization off the ground. So in Oakland, California, there were some young men. There was Huey P. Newton, there was Bobby Seale, and some other young men who came together and decided to form an organization that would work towards achieving the goals that Malcolm X wanted. And the name of the organization was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense early on. And the reason why they had the self-defense in there, because police brutality was a paramount issue in the black community. You know, black people were killed, were jailed, were beaten with impunity all the time, over and over and over again. And I remember growing up in Seattle, I remember hearing about black people being killed, and I remember that sense of hopelessness, that sense, well, you know, another black person was killed. And that feeling that like there wasn't going to be any justice, that there really wasn't anything that we can do about it. And so this is what the Black Panther Party came out of. You know, a lot of black people had migrated to California from Louisiana, from Mississippi, from Texas, from Chicago. They migrated to Southern California. They migrated to Northern California, and to work in the weapons manufacturing plants that they had at that time. And after they had been there over a period of time, they lost a lot of the fear that they had brought with them from the South. And they began to build their families and build their communities, and began to feel more empowered and much stronger than they had when they were in the South. They saw much more possibilities. But what happened was the police departments in Oakland and in Los Angeles began to recruit police officers from Mississippi, from Alabama, from Louisiana, from Georgia. And these police officers brought a lot of their same racist attitudes with them to California. And so in 1965, they had the first major riot in America, the Watts riot. That was the first major riot in America. That riot lasted for 3 days, and millions of dollars of damage was done. There were over 50, 60 people that were killed. Police were shot at. A lot of businesses were burned. And this really was a explosion of frustration that had been built up over 100 years or so, of frustration of watching police brutality, of watching racism, and not being able to do anything about it, and it just ended up into this explosion that led to the Watts riot. But every year after that, every summer after, because you know, if you can imagine living in a what was called ghettos, where there was a lot of poverty, you know, a lot of unemployment, a lot of dissatisfaction the way that things were going on, you know, being patrolled by white police officers, you know, white businesses selling things to you overpriced, and then the summer comes, it gets real hot, and you know, maybe you've had a few drinks of wine, and then you see something that you've seen before, but this time things are different, and you just say, no, we're not going to take this anymore, and we're just going to go off, and we're just going to go crazy. And that's what happened. And so these riots started happening every summer after '65. You know, in Detroit, in Chicago, in Newark, New Jersey, in Harlem, and all the major cities in America. You know that when the summertime came, that there was going to be a big riot, and that riot was going to last for 3 or 4 days. And they began to call them rebellions. Now the first really major rebellion they had was in Detroit. And the Detroit rebellion lasted for almost 2 to 3 weeks. And the snipers in the community actually drove the police out of the community, and they actually took over the community. And they called the National Guard to come in. The National Guard wouldn't go in because they were composed of mostly black soldiers, and they had to call the army in. And so you had tanks, you had helicopters. They began to patrol the streets of Detroit to try to take them back. So also what you also had was, at that time in Africa, you had the countries in Africa, black people in those countries had come together and started fighting for their freedom from the colonizers of Europe. You know, all through Africa, you know, Tanzania, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, many other places had these revolutionary movements that began to come forth and overthrow the colonizers. South America, you had the same thing. You had the poor people, the peasants, that began to come together in places like Brazil and Argentina and Chile and Bolivia and many other places that wanted the wealthy American businesses out of their country. They wanted them to quit stealing the resources out of their country. They wanted the puppet governments that America had set up. They wanted, they waged war against them. So you have revolutionary movements going on there. As well as in Cuba. You know, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara had marched on Cuba in 1969 and freed it from its oppression and freed it from the American businessmen that used Cuba as its personal playground. So, you know, the whole word revolutionary was always in the papers, and it became a word that everybody was beginning to get familiar with. So back in Oakland, 1966, the Black Panther Party emerges, and it becomes a revolutionary organization, and their main focus at the beginning is to end police brutality. Now, Huey P. Newton was a law student. He also had a genius. He had a mind. He had the mind of a genius. You know, his analytical skills was far superior than any other black leaders at that time, even though he was still very young. But the other thing about Huey P. Newton was that he was fearless. He wasn't afraid of anyone or anything. You know, he was the youngest of 7 children. His brothers all taught him how to fight, and they always taught him, you always throw the first punch. And he became a legendary street fighter. And so, you know, the combination of him being a legendary street fighter, you know, he wasn't a real big person. He wasn't real tough. It's about 5'10". But he wasn't afraid of anybody, no matter what size they were, and he took on all comers. And so he had that fearlessness about him. And so, you know, you put those two things together, that brilliant mind he had and that fearlessness he had, and you had a magnificent human being in Huey P. Newton. And now Bobby Seale and Huey became good friends at Merritt College. Bobby Seale was had had been through the Air Force. He was an architectural structural engineer.